Do you want to learn more on how to put money to work in regenerative food and agriculture? Follow our video course via investinginregenerativeagriculture.com/course or in the links below. Now, on to the podcast. What is the role of the largest commodity buyers and brands in the world, like Nestlè and Ferrero, in the regenerative transition? How can they be part of decommodifying their supply chain from an extractive to a regenerative one? Today, we tackle the tension between top-down and bottom-up approach, being very, very humble, and how large brands need a much more holistic view of quality. And why do you maybe need to work on small and very deep regenerative projects that seem to be impossible to scale? Welcome to another episode of Investing in Regenerative Agriculture, Investing as if the planet mattered, a podcast show where I talk to the pioneers in the regenerative food and agriculture space to learn more on how to put our money to work to regenerate soil, people, local communities and ecosystems while making an appropriate and fair return. Why my focus on soil and regeneration? Because so many of the pressing issues we face today have their roots in how we treat our land, grow our food and what we eat. And it's time that we as investors, big and small, and consumers start paying much more attention to the dirt/soil underneath our feet. In March last year, we launched our membership community to make it easy for fans to support our work, and so many of you have joined as a member. We've launched different types of benefits, exclusive content, Q&A webinars with former guests, Ask Me Anything sessions, plus so much more to come in the future. For more information on the different tiers, benefits, and how to become a member, check gumroad.com/investingregenag or find the link below. Thank you. Welcome to another episode. Today with Bastien Sachet, the CEO of the Earthworm Foundation since 2016. The Earthworm Foundation exists for much longer, and we'll go into that, but is a non-profit organization that built on values and driven by the desire to positively impact the relationship between people and nature. They work with some of the largest agriculture commodity buyers in the world to cultivate more life in their value chains, and we're also going to get into what that means. They're focusing on deforestation, agriculture, chocolate, coffee, hazelnuts, and much, much more. Welcome, Bastien.
Hi, Koen.
And to start with a question, how did you end up in soil, agriculture, deforestation, land use, and what brought you there?
Well, personally, I'm an agronomist and I've grown up in the countryside. So, of course, these are things I've always been close to. But it's only as I went into my professional career that I started to do different things. And I ended up at some stage, after various steps, having this vision in Argentina on a soy field where I see the soil going up in dust and on GM crops and cans of Roundup on the side. And I'm thinking, that's not what I want to do. We can change that. And then I found this organization, which at the time was called the Forest Trust, which had the objective to make forest well managed. And I thought, wow, that's great because it combines the business side. We can have products coming out of the forest, wood, etc., and keeping them as they should be, healthy. So I started to work with the TFT in 2006. And then we started to work on really two key ecosystems, forests and soils, because they are the main habitats for life. I like to say they are kind of the belly of the earth. They are where life starts. And what we eat, what we wear, what we burn, what we use to live basically comes from there. So for us, it's really what needs to be the focus.
No, completely. I think for hopefully for anybody listening to this podcast. If not, there's some great books you should read. Reach out to me. I will let you know some great farms to visit. But then, the organization was mostly, when you joined, mostly focused on forests. Obviously, forest growth in soil. But how did that gradual or quick transition happen to much more focused on commodities, agriculture? You're also working in grain at the moment. How did that come back to the soy discovery you had when you were in that field?
So we've always been leveraging the power of businesses and their supply chains to create change at the origin of those supply chains. And at the time, the supply chains were really the timber and wood supply chains linked to garden furniture, because that's where the focus was, and the realization that all this production was driving deforestation, especially in Asia. And we proved and we learned how to use the purchase and the procurement of companies in the downstream to really leverage change in the upstream. And we saw it was possible. So we thought, okay, that's a great thing. And in 2007, the Stern reports come showing how important forests are for climate. And personally, I was sitting in a four-wheel drive, visiting one of our projects in Indonesia, in Kalimantan, and I see all these logging trucks and bulldozers being lined up just nearby the forest. And I say, how was that? And the forest manager says, we've just sold half of the forest and it's going to become a palm plantation. And I'm like, oh no, so we've done all that in vain. And maybe we need to focus on other supply chains. And our model could work with palm, with cocoa, with all these commodities that drive change. And so we went into these commodities and we started to work on tackling deforestation through agricultural commodities. And of course, when you dig deeper, you get to the farmer and the smallholders and how they manage the land, because the way they manage their land is going to impact the forest. And then quickly you come to the source, and the essence of everything is, what do you get from your soil? How do you interact with your soils and your agriculture? And we realize that all of this is one whole thing. It's a holistic approach. In the same way we were seeing human beings, people, workers being exploited, we think, we're not an environmental organization and we will leave the social to other people. We take this holistic approach that is about human is part of nature, soils, forest, and people, rural communities and workers who are there are really our focus. And that's how we really embrace the whole thing. And that's what we work on at the moment.
And it's a great bridge to unpack a bit how you're working, because I think it sounds amazing. We're working on the big commodities that cause deforestation, if we like it or not, palm oil, many others. I mean, chocolate in an industrial way, coffee. I mean, there's so much stress on the forests that if you only focus on the forest, you're just not going to win the battle, even though it started with garden furniture, which I still remember the teak discussions a long time ago, which started a lot of awareness, actually. But we thought only wood. And of course, there are many products. So can you describe in a way how you then work with a large commodity player, a large commodity buyer, a large brand? Obviously, you don't have to name them, but what is a good example of how a process like that starts? How do you get them to really care and really do something?
There is two aspects. I think there is an aspect where you engage with people, individuals in those companies. So often we say we've got member companies, but often we work with individuals. And when you see those individuals switch from companies to company, you see that they ignite an approach and a process in their own companies. And then there is the practicality of what we do.
Do you then follow them as well? Like, if they move to another company, that old company hopefully stays a client and then a new one as well? Is that?
Often it happens. And it's quite interesting because you can see the impact spreading a bit in this way. And then, as I said, there's the practicality of what we do. We believe that sustainability is nothing else than managing environmental and social quality. And what companies know how to do is to give you quality products. If you drink a can of Coke, to take a very well-known product, you're not going to get sick. Companies have put all the processes in place so that they check everything before it gets to your mouth and to your body. And we're thinking, well, today what consumers are asking for is really a more holistic view of quality. Environmental and social quality are important, but it means companies need to shift their thinking and extend the walls of their factories, if you want, which traditionally were the limits of what they look at, to the whole supply chain starting at the farmer's plot. So it makes companies think a bit differently about that. And then it's just a normal process of taking interest, being quite humble, not coming with norms and don't do this and don't do that, which has been a lot of the punitive ecology approach, I would say, in the past. They need to come with an open mind to say, how do we create something that benefits everyone? One thing we have to remind is that supply chains today, commodity supply chains, they are inherently extractive. So they are built, and the business model is built on extracting natural capital, extracting human capital. This is why you still have child labor in cocoa. This is why you have people working for very low, undecent salaries in palm oil plantations sometimes. This is why we are tapping into forest all the time to get fertility. And it's not like there are no ways to do differently. It's just the way it's been, because of opacity, because of not really looking after where, or asking the question, where does it come from? So if you want, in a way, what we ask companies is, ask yourself the questions. How do I relate to people in nature? Where does it come from? How has it been made? All these simple questions, everyone can ask them. And if you start asking those questions, then you open the opportunity to change. And that's what we do with companies. Going in the field, asking, discussing with the suppliers, but not in a way where everything comes with, you should not do this, stop that, put a norm, verify that. No. First, understand, ask questions. 2, engage. 3, build trust. And then together with everyone in the supply chains, figure out how everyone can be winning out of that. And I mean economically as well. Mainly, how a farmer can make better business, how a supplier can thrive and how a brand can be successful as well with its consumers by taking such an approach. So I would say more an ecology of solutions.
So let's say a company calls you up and says, we've heard about you, Bastien and Earthworm. It's fascinating. We probably have a problem, or we get a lot of questions about our supply chain, etc. What do you do first? What's your first step in engaging with them, which is the first step? But how do you engage with them? You meet the people. Is that the people on the top? Is that the people buying the cocoa? Is that a first, let's say, discovery contract with them? Because you probably want to ask a lot of questions, but you also don't want to lose the potential of having a client. So how would they hire you for a period and allow you to ask a lot of probably difficult questions, but humble? Is that how it works?
I would say we're a bit like when you go to the doctors, you got this first appointment.
You're not a consultant, right?
Not at all.
How would you describe yourself?
I like the work, a doctor is not a consultant. He does consult, okay, but he's not a consultant. So I would really compare the process that we implement to the ones that doctors implement. It's kind of a healing process. So the company comes and says, look, I want to change. Either it's because an NGO campaign, a consumer pressure, the CEO's decision, or just some individuals within the company thinking, hey, why don't we try something different? So we sit down, we listen, and we understand what is the magnitude of their problem, how deeply they want to change. And then we will try to together start a journey where we're going to go quickly on the ground and assess, engage suppliers. We will check whether they've got something in writing about what they want in terms of environmental and social quality. If they don't, we will start by writing that together, because we believe that turning the intention into words and then putting those words into action is what we do. So if there are no words, we'll put the words on the paper. Recently, Ferrero is working on its hazelnut charter. Okay, what is responsible hazelnut?
Just as background, Ferrero is the maker of Nutella and a lot of other products with hazelnut in it, just for the people that don't know the company behind it.
Exactly. So that's one example. We did that with Nestlé on palm oil. We worked with Wilmar in the same way. So we try to put words. With these words, we will then engage the suppliers, and the suppliers will tell us, well, this is where we're at, this is what we think, and we'll deploy the teams on the ground to figure out, to test, to visit some suppliers, etc. Then we'll prioritize. We'll say, okay, where should we focus first? What are the biggest challenges that this supply chain faces? And it varies from country to country. So palm oil in Malaysia, it's mostly a social issue. In Indonesia, we'll talk about deforestation and expansion. And so we'll really try to build a plan of transformation. What becomes really interesting is that we will ask systematically to know where the raw materials come from. This is a big hurdle. Often people say, traceability is not so important. I said, yes, you need to know where things come from, because we cannot change what we cannot see. And then we talk to the traders, we talk to the commodity suppliers who have for years thrived on opacity. They are the kings of making 1 ton of palm oil equivalent everywhere in the world. And what we say is you source from different landscapes, from different terroirs, and you have to recognize first that these exist. And that is done by highlighting the information of where it comes from. I remember I talk about palm oil because it's a commodity we've worked a lot on. When we started, the buyer of Nestlé told us, look, it will be very difficult to get traceability. It's almost impossible. It gets traded so many times, etc. 10 years later, most of the industry have traceability to all the mills, the 2,500 mills on the planet, and now progressively towards plantation. It's possible. And then after that, we'll engage on the ground. And that becomes really interesting, because then we will pool the influence of different brands in a given landscape. You take a landscape in Indonesia or in Africa, you got all sorts of raw materials coming out of it. So we enter with one raw material, let's say rubber, and then you'll see they produce cocoa, they produce flavor and fragrances, palm, food. And then we'll start working together with the government, with the different companies that source from there, and the farmers to figure out, okay, what's a path towards regeneration? And that's, I think, what also companies appreciated, that they're doing the work in their supply chain, but eventually at landscape level, they connect with others.
And is it difficult to get in that buy-in? Like you said, sometimes it's people within the company, let's say at a medium or senior level, but you need the buy-in from the top, and you target specifically the top, as I know. How do you get the real senior management that probably has never visited a palm oil implantation, or how do you get them to support it? I wouldn't say excited, but to see the potential of regen ag, to see the potential of agroforestry, to get them out of their office, basically, maybe literally. What's your strategy there?
You just said it. We try to get them to the field. The best ever engagement I've noticed is to take a CEO to the field, get him to touch the soil, get him to meet people, get him to reconnect with the reality he's connected to and that he has long forgotten about, because his worries are in meeting rooms, his days are in meetings and calls and dealing with problems that are more linked to the downstream part of their work, to the branding, to the supermarket, the retailers, etc., his clients. But it rarely focuses on the suppliers. So we take the opportunity together with the staff of the very company we work with to say, hey, let's organize a little trip. Let's go and see by ourselves. And I seize any opportunity I can to do that. I remember once with the CEO of Nestlè France, he says, look, regenerative agriculture is really interesting. And I said, let's go and have a look. And we got Professor Boivin, who is a researcher on soils in Geneva, to organize a little visit with us at the farmers who were, doing regenerative agriculture. And I remember that day when we came and it was, really cold, the wind blowing, and I'm like, oh my goodness, am I not killing my relationship with the guy by bringing him?
Or the guy itself, yeah.
Yes, or the guy itself. And, we had this lovely moment where the farmer had prepared a little foldable table and he had some warm coffee. For some reason, I didn't even ask him, he had prepared a pot of Nescafe, hot water and Nescafe. And he says,
which is a nice touch for a Nestlé CEO of France. Yeah.
A very nice touch. It's funny. And he had bought some croissants from the local bakery. And he said, look, I'm going to show you what I'm doing. And he was not at all impressed. He was just being himself and very frank in even asking challenging questions to the CEO. But we had this very human connection. We all got some earth in our hands and started to touch the mud and try to understand. And I know that from this point, the CEO really said, look, that makes total sense. I had a feeling this was important, but that just reminds me how really important it is for me. And I think that these are the kinds of moments where it's not the only thing, there are many things that make people change, but reconnecting to nature, feeling that you're doing something important for the world. I think all of these are things that are buried into our human nature. And then when they have the opportunity to come out, I think it's important. It was the same for me when I had this wake-up call earlier on. So I know that this process is a multiple impressionist touches that comes from conversations, the investor saying you need to do that, and yourself walking through an exploratory journey and reconnecting to nature.
I think many listeners can connect to that. And I mean, it's actually in your mission statement of the connection between people and nature. And probably it's one of the core challenges we have. We are so disconnected, and thus we don't know where, in our personal life and obviously in our business life, we have no idea where the palm oil comes from or where our food in general comes from. Plus, we're mostly in meetings in offices, etc. And we're now starting to see the terrible price we pay for that. But to get people out in the field, it's not easy. But once it happens, I have seen it a few times as well. It really gets people, everything they thought about agriculture or read, etc., even if they didn't pay too much attention, turned out to be way more complex and way more interesting and way more opportunities than they could ever imagine. And in forest, obviously, that's the same. So you get the CEO on board, but then you go very, very deep. You go deep into one landscape. It's not that you try to change the whole palm oil sector at once. You decide to go very deep into even different produce in the same landscape. That's very deliberate. Can you explain why that is?
Yes. What we believe is that if you take a supply chain of a Nestlé, a Ferrero, a Mars, these large companies, it just connects to pretty much everywhere in the world. I remember when we started looking at Nestlé's pulp and paper supply chain for the packaging, and we contemplated 3,000 suppliers. And this has just the converters. And behind the converters, you have the mills. And behind the mills, you have the forest owners. And you're like, oh my goodness, this is just too complex. We'll never get to the end of it. So what we do is to look at, okay, where does it hurt? Where are the supply chains connected?
Hurt for the company.
No, for nature and people. So where are the companies connected? So it's important for me as a company, that region, because it's where I source and I need that sourcing. Let's say the southeast of the US, for example, is a basin where a lot of the pulp and paper from the world comes out. There is no single company, large company, that cannot source from there for its pulp and paper supply. It's impossible. You are necessarily connected there.
Sorry, you say pulp and paper, meaning the ingredients basically to make the packaging. Yeah.
Yeah, and it's made from forest.
So every company in the world that makes packaging at some point sources part of that from that region. Like you're touched by it.
Inevitably, because a lot of the pulp that is produced in the world is coming from those areas. It's a bit like soy in Brazil. The commoditization of supply chains have located the supply of cocoa in Ivory Coast, Indonesia, palm. It's very concentrated. So basically, supply chains are what they are. We're not judging of whether it's good or bad. We're pushing for more resilience, more diversification, but still you see these pockets of impact that exist on ecosystems. So we got forests and we got a lot of people sourcing from there. And then we look at what's critical. What are endangered ecosystems? Things that really need to be preserved because they matter for nature. And then we will work at the heart of that and we will focus. So rather than doing assessments and visits everywhere, we will focus there. And we'll say, look, let's try to find a solution.
So where it hurts the most in, let's say, this watershed, where the most, I'm just making up an example, the most chemical leaching of this paper production or the most soil erosion, or like where it hurts the most within this area where most, in this case of the pulp and paper, comes from, that's where you want to be.
Absolutely. So, for example, we engaged in Indonesia where we know there's pulp plantation planted on peat and there are social conflicts. We know this is a place that you need to look at with a lot of care. And if we can find solutions there, or if we can find solutions in the southeast of the US, these solutions can be replicated at scale. And there what we will do is we will innovate together with the various partners in the landscapes to say, for example, how do we measure the forest health, knowing that you got people coming in taking biomass, other taking wood for pulp, wood for cellulose, wood for viscose, wood for packaging. So you got all these uses, and people are not equipped today to have indicators to know how we manage this forest. So we will work together with them. We'll bring in scientists. We say, hey, how do we keep the finger on the pulse of that forest? We'll bring technology and we'll go deep. We'll try, we fail, we try, we fail. And eventually we come up with a methodology or a solution that we deliberately want to remain open source. And then we said, okay, you can use it. I give you a great example, which I'm very proud of, which we did on forest products. In 2004, we started to work with a timber company in Congo, which had 1.2 million hectares of management of concessions, pristine forests.
Not small, yeah.
Yeah, quite a lot. And really in the middle of the Congo Basin with the elephants, the gorillas, everything you can imagine that is pristine about our forest, emblematic animals. And they had a big challenge because they wanted to get this FSC certification, but they could not because there were pygmy population, indigenous population in the middle who use the timbers, and you need to get their consent and the free, prior, and informed consent concept, and impossible to get. And we thought, and everyone, the industry was saying, yeah, FSC is bad, it's impossible for Africa, it's not suited for Africa, etc. And we thought, how can we unlock that problem? So we worked with this company. We brought scientists from the University College of London. We brought technology company. We started to work and say, how can we get the consent from people who are not literate, semi-nomadic, and who are not organized in a traditional society? They are little groups of people. There's no boss. So we thought, okay.
No, they are organized in a traditional society, but not ours. They were maybe the traditional one.
Yes, exactly. Not in a traditional way as we think it, as you say, yeah. So we worked with them and we found a way where the communities could actually map on a GPS by themselves all the trees that are important to them in the forest and say to the company, don't touch these trees because they are ours. And we need them. Trees for prayer, trees where they eat the caterpillars and everything. And it happened. So they mapped all the trees, the fishing areas, the sacred areas, and you had a new layer of the forest that was the layers of the pygmies coming on top of all the other environmental and social layers that existed already.
Which completely ignored any of these layers. I mean, completely ignored their layer, obviously.
Completely. And the company said, okay, we are committed to manage things in the best possible way. So we'll do that. And we will give up on harvesting those logs, those trees, etc. And it happened. And so the company got FSC certified. And then what happened is you had a wave of companies who committed to do that in the Congo Basin. Up to 6 million hectares, I think, got certified. We didn't do it. We just shared the methodology and we created a center for social excellence to train young experts. So suddenly scale happened because there was a practical solution to a given problem that created value for everyone. And I think to do this, Funnily enough, everyone says, yeah, you need to go to scale, and they think scale first. I think we need to have faith that scale comes when you create something useful, which means letting go of the desire to power and manage everything, control everything, power everything. You need to let go and trust the fact that complex systems will self-reorganize. And it's a bit like what happens in nature. Nature comes up with something, and then the world reorganizes. It's chaotic. I don't know if you know the theory of chaos in physics, but I very much believe in that because that's how chain reactions happen. And so all we have to do, focus on trying to solve the problem in a practical way and work with people to find what creates value for everyone and then share it. Share it with communication, scale it with finance, scale it with technology. There's plenty of tools to scale. Our role is to incubate and make that new solution emerge. And I really believe that that way we can really tackle things at scale without ourselves becoming big and powerful, etc. And we very much see that working in practice.
Wow, there's a lot to unpack, but let's start with a devil's advocate question. That sounds amazing. Let's say I'm Nestlé or I'm a big commodity buyer in general. I'm imagining it's quite difficult for me as a senior manager there to accept this fluid, chaotic process because I would love to have a project with you. I'm hiring you and there needs to be an outcome ready.
Yep.
And at the same time, in that question, actually, the company, even if it's one company working in a much bigger basin, the company pays for that process, even though their impact might be on the whole basin, on many other companies that are also getting FSC. So they're sort of agreeing to that open sourceness, chaoticness process that maybe nothing comes out, or maybe something completely different than they imagined or they called you for. Like, we need a solution, but we actually already have an idea, but maybe in your work you find something completely different. How do you deal with very rigid potential clients that are not made for the chaos yet?
Sometimes we don't even deal with them. They don't want to work with us. So I give you, again, the metaphor of the doctor. For disease or illnesses that are well known, there are treatments that are well known. And some doctors who are just, even eyes closed, they said, okay, these guys got a flu, aspirin plus this, plus that, go away. And these are the traditional consultants who will churn out a lot of that. And their model is to just do as many of that as possible. And then you've got the complicated illnesses, the complex disease, the things that, it doesn't yet exist a treatment for: deforestation, human exploitation. How do you change the climate impact of your supply chain? All these things.
Decommodifying, huge commodity.
All these things. And then companies, I think it requires doses of humility from the side of companies and also from our side to say, well, we don't know if we can heal. But what we can do is to have a go at it. What's our plan is, and this is what we tell companies, that we intend to do it this way, but we constantly review and adapt. So the challenge is this very adaptive and agile nature that we need to keep, alongside with key principles that, okay, we will find a solution. We will be open to be surprised by what the reality tells us. So it's a very much agile trial and error process, but guided by the constant desire to have an impact, and we measure results. We measure results so that we can see, is it working or not?
And how do you measure, or what do you measure normally? I mean, it depends, obviously, but what are key metrics that usually come back?
So we try to objectivize nature. So we'll try to measure the deforestation rate.
How? Yeah. Okay, deforestation rate, obviously, biomass in the forest.
Yeah, I'll take proxies for the health of those ecosystems. So soil health, which is based on structure, carbon, etc. So we try to measure that. Farmer prosperity, farmer resilience. These are two important things. And then forest health, which is a good proxy of it, is forest density or forest cover. And these are not complicated things to manage. And they're good proxies also for the climate impact.
They're not complicated things to measure. Probably they're difficult to manage.
Exactly. But once you know what impact is happening, you try different things to see whether, the system will change or readapt. Just like a farmer tries and says, I'll try that cover crop. It didn't work this year. The yield was not so good. Why? And you constantly try to play with the system to try to adjust. So yes, for big corporates, especially industrial ones who are used to fully control the environment, before they land, they want to know where they start. This 5 years project, in 5 years, where will I be? I can give you an indication of the direction, but I don't give you a guarantee that this is exactly where you'll be. Magellan, when he started to think, I believe we can go to the Pacific. There is a Pacific Ocean. I believe there is a world without deforestation. But how do we get there? when he's along the coast of Argentina and he's trying Mar del Plata, and he doesn't get there, his funders in Spain and in Portugal are like, come on, what is he doing? But somehow they have faith and trust, saying there must be something, and we will find.
Also, they were so far away that they couldn't really control him as well. I mean, it's the communication lines were very, very long, so you had months and months of freedom before the letters arrived.
That helps. Unfortunately, the companies keep asking every month where we are on the project, but we don't have that freedom. But yes, in a way, there is trust. There is mutual trust, so we need to deliver progress. But on the other hand, there is a mutual trust and humility from companies saying, hey, we can't do everything by ourselves. We need others. We need collective action. And here is a path that seems to make sense to us. They trust their gut. They're like, sounds good. And there is really a typology of company that works with us, is these companies that are able to do that and the companies that are not able to let go. And they're like, no, we need to control everything. We need to know the metrics. And these companies, they will try to fall back on more traditional approaches. They will try to seek big coalitions that predefine everything. Logically, it can make sense, but in practice, it doesn't work.
Yeah, you mentioned in a pre-interview, like as soon as you get to the big consortium, big groups, scale becomes political very quickly, and thus everything stops or moves in an incredibly slow pace. And that's one of the reasons you chose to go deep and really deep into, and not choose to have every buyer of every palm oil or every buyer of every pulp combined into tackling these issues.
Yes, it's a different theory of change than the one that has been predominant for the last 20 years, which was to say, let's agree on what sustainability is.
Let's agree on what regeneration is, which nobody knows. Yeah.
And then you've got a group of people who try to hijack the discussion and say, this is what it's going to be. And they try to use their political power to impose a certain vision. It is doomed to fail. Why? Because when you put people together, inevitably, it becomes political unless you have nature in the middle or a map or something to discuss concretely. But if it's just to align, it becomes political. To stay relevant, they will need to have everyone on board. To have everyone on board, you need to dilute your values and you need to adopt the lowest common denominator. So it will lose ambition. And third, last but not least, if you don't work with the farmers, if you don't work with the communities on the ground, with the people who are managing the land, you're missing the main actors. And so if all the corporates and, governments sit down together saying, this is what it's going to be, it is inevitably profiting them first. It's not co-design. Therefore, it will never go to scale. Therefore, it's going to have to be pushed onto people, and therefore it will never work.
Extractive.
It
has to be extractive.
Top down, and it doesn't work. So we prefer this bottom-up approach, supporting by a kind top-down approach, bottom-up rooted in practice, rooted in concrete, producing solutions that create value and that by themselves they can scale.
And just to give an indication, and actually we get to the name then, because we started and it was called Forest Trust. You took over in 2016, you decided to change the name. Can you give a bit of an indication, first of all, why? And also what's the size of the organization, just to give an indication that it's not 3 people in a room somewhere, it's actually quite sizable. And then we get to why Earthworm.
So the founder, Scott Poynton, is a great guy who started the organization.
When was that?
It was in 1999. He's got a blog and I encourage you to have a look at it. When he started the organization, he was very inspired by earthworms. And it's been something that we've always had within the organization. And when he stepped down and I stepped in, this idea of being named Earthworm was not new. This is something we wanted to do. And so I decided, let's go for it. And it was a bit of a shock initially because it's not like we're going to be called the eagle or the bull or something, quite powerful. Earthworm is a bit dirty. It's not the animal you necessarily identify to.
You don't want to touch. Yeah. I do, but some people are like, yeah.
It's a bit weird. Huh?
But actually, it's one of the most powerful animals, one of the most powerful, relevant in the universe.
And I'm glad you're saying that because that's the way we see it as well. For us, an earthworm it's the best symbol of circularity. It recycles constantly. It connects the world between the surface and the depths. We talk to NGOs, we talk to communities, we talk to big multinationals. We try to connect these people to create something fertile. And the earthworm does that. It connects the organic and the mineral and eventually produces humus, which is something that nests life, that hosts life. So we like that. And we also like the idea of working at the roots of supply chains where it's needed and getting our boots on the ground and our hands dirty with mud Okay, he doesn't have hands nor feet, but you see the metaphor. And that's how we thought, we need to become who we are. We had not had the opportunity to do that before, but then it made total sense to become who we wanted to be.
Also because you're more and more into agriculture and, I mean, obviously very deep into forest, but not only anymore.
Yes.
Can you describe a bit of your work, let's say, on row cropping or non-forest commodities at the moment?
Exactly. And so it made sense to say, earthworm, you find them in the forest, you find them in agricultural fields, and you find them in companies. All the people we work with, they are earthworms within their companies. One day, there was a lady from the bank. She said, I'm the earthworm here. I'm the earthworm in this bank. And I like the image because it's this relentless cultivation of life. Whatever happens, whatever is dumped on the soil, problems, etc., the person keeps going and trying to cultivate something healthy and fertile. And I really like that. Maybe just to answer your question, the organization today is about 230 people. Around the world, we are in 16 offices, but 80% of the staff is really on the ground, close to supplier, farmers, forest, and working actively in landscapes.
And what kind of clients? I mean, you mentioned a few. What are the biggest commodities or biggest crops you work in, or the biggest landscape, whatever you want to define it? If somebody asks you about your clients, what do you answer?
We work with a lot of brands and some of their suppliers. Among the biggest brands will be Nestlè, Ferrero, Mars, Reckitt Benckiser, PZ Cussons, brands who are relying on natural raw materials, be they pulp and paper, rubber, palm, cocoa, soy, cereals, things that will go really in their products and be important for them. And then we'll engage their suppliers, and some of the suppliers like, I like this approach. I want to apply it not just for that client, but for everyone. And that's what we will do. Sometimes we engage with investors as well, who are more and more starting to think, I'm invested in all these companies. How are they doing? How can I get them to embark on an approach that is transformative? And so we'll work with them.
How many clients do you have in total?
We work with about 120 companies. The smallest one probably is a charcoal producer in the east of France, and the biggest one will be Nestlé, I would say.
Wow, the full value chain.
Yeah.
That's very interesting. And in terms of outside, I mean, you mentioned cereals and grains. Have you seen that grow, like the agriculture and not necessarily the agroforestry piece? Is that something that has been moving?
You mean how companies embrace?
Yeah, no, row cropping as well. I mean, obviously Nestlé buys everything, but you've started, I think, working with them mostly on the forestry products or the plantation products. How has been your shift, or not your broader focus now on agriculture?
What I'd say, look, is that a lot of companies have engaged on their raw material purchase through risk management. So the 2000s, the year 2000s, were marked by, we need to find out where that come from. And we need to clear that risk. We don't want a problem. We don't want a reputational issue. So the management would tell the people in the sourcing, do whatever it takes to sort out that problem. I don't want my name in the papers. That was the mandate initially. And you go only that far with that mandate because you don't really engage in regeneration.
The bare minimum. Yeah.
Yeah, you try to clear out the risk, but eventually it's not fully associated to the creation of value. What's happening, I would say, since a few years now, is that you have another community asking companies to change. Before it was the NGOs. Now it's the NGOs plus the consumers plus the investors. Consumers and investors are much more important to your bottom line if you're a company, to your survival, economic survival, than NGOs. So it's creating different things. The leaders that are put at the head of companies, they need to have sustainability in mind. Just take the new CEO of Airbus. He had, and one of his key things, Guillaume Faury, is, how do we shift aviation? Right, big challenge, but that's also why probably as a CEO, he can't dismiss the topic. He is being asked by investors to deal with that. Mark Schneider, the CEO of Nestlé, is the same. Is there, has to put sustainability and take it in account as part of one of his key objectives. 1. 2, consumers are asking, do I want to buy a fake story about this chocolate bar? Or can you tell me the real story? Because otherwise I'm going to shift to another brand. I'm going to shift to the local cereal bean to bar who can tell whose story is the very story of how it's been made, by whom, etc. But if I buy it from you, I get something a bit fake and I don't know really where it comes from. And people are telling me it's bad. So I'm going to probably shift. So there is an inherent need to shift that is being put back to the businesses by consumers and investors. And then it makes business think, hey, I really need to embrace that differently. So what the change is marked by much more proactivity from companies to say, I want to know where it comes from. I want it to be good. I want it to be good for planet, for people. Please help me. So it's not about why should I do it? It's about how can I do it? And what's fascinating is we see a big appetite, despite the current recession, to keep that journey going. We were expecting that people would completely, drop their investment in these aspects because it was kind of CSR stuff. It's not. It's like, and we want to accelerate. The climate crisis is still there. COVID is linked to that. We'll have other episodes like that. So we need to change. And of course, some companies are suffering, but we can see the intentions are still there.
No, that's very interesting. And to shift gears a bit, I mean, you mentioned already investors a few times, and you have an interesting overview of the sector, obviously, as you are deep into the supply chains and you know the brands. And so it's a question I like to ask. If you, tomorrow morning, you wake up and you're the head of an investment fund, of a $1 billion investment fund, let's put a nice amount in that, how would you put that to work? Obviously, we're not giving investment advice here, but I'm very curious on your view of where you think a fund like that, so it's investment, they're not grants, but they could be very long-term investments. What would you do?
What I observe today is that there's been a lot of investment going to the downstream. So the downstream of the supply chain for me is the part that is closest to the consumer, and the upstream is closest to the farmer. If you look at how many brands and how much investment is put into the downstream to optimize the route of the yogurt pot between the industry and the retailer. How do we make sure the packaging is lighter, that the cardboard box is this and that, and everything is optimized to the maximum. And a lot of investment and business models are being developed there. It's also, where people are in the cities. So they look at what they've got around them and they start developing ideas and pitching to people who have money, who are in the cities, these kind of same things.
The same bubble, yeah.
The same bubble. And they get stuck very quickly because they're like, that's not really changing the world a little bit, but,
Most of the impact is not downstream. Yeah, it's upstream.
Exactly. The impact on forest, on people, on climate is upstream. And this realization is accompanied by the fact that when you look at what's happening between the farmer and his first client, the co-op or the guy who buys his raw materials, there is very little innovation. I would say near to nothing. It's like a desert. So if you put a little bit of money there to sprout new ideas, to incubate new ideas, or to stimulate new ideas, there is entrepreneurship. You look at Africa, for example, there's lots of entrepreneurs there, but they are not revealed. They're not supported. So you don't have a deal flow of investment coming out of that. But that's where investment could make a lot of difference. I'll give you an example. We're in the palm oil supply chain of Nestlé. We have companies in Ivory Coast who supply palm oil. So the farmers harvest the palm, they put it on the side of the road, and then the mill comes and collects them. As part of a diagnostic, we talk to the mill, and the mill says, you know what, these guys are useless. Whenever we come to pick up the fruit with the trucks, the fruits are rotten. And when we go to the mill, we can't process them, the quality goes down, etc. Palm oil, you need to process it within 24 hours. And then on the side, we talk to the farmers, and the farmer says, these mills, they are really useless. They always come up late.
Come late. Yeah.
So we said, okay, let's coordinate. So we take a piece of paper, we put it in the village, and we said the truck will be there on Tuesday. And the truck is there on Tuesday. And then the fruits are picked up. So farmer gets more money, the mill gets more money. Everyone's winning. And a lot more production because you reduce waste. I mean, this is dead simple. Huh? We then talk to people to say, look, why don't you invest a bit of time to make that digital? Everyone's got a smartphone. You just can coordinate this kind of stuff. And then we put it into the hands of local entrepreneurs, and they're developing this kind of stuff. So I'm thinking this is just giving a little bit of attention to a problem which is present all across Africa, touches all the smallholders, and could drastically reduce the waste, drastically reduce the need for expanding on new plantation, drastically increase farmers' income. So to respond to your question, let's take some of that billion and put it to identify opportunities. Identify opportunities at the very roots of the supply chains, in between the farmer.
But you're meaning one step after the farmer. That's the sweet spot you're talking about.
Yes. All the fertilizer, chemical companies, they have a lot of thinking around how do we make the farmer more efficient. There's a lot of business around data and technology. How do we get the data from the farmer? Yeah, okay, that's all right. And I think it's probably too much thinking going in there. I would really focus on that first step, on the collaboration and all the opportunities around the value chain connection, supply chain connection that exists between the farmer and his first client. There is a lot there.
The first chain, basically, the first piece. Yeah.
Exactly. That would be a first thing. And then I would really use the money, and this is my second point, to ignite, to start, to seed fund, to try and fail. Because I believe the funds, the big funds are there. The other billions are there to scale up. I'm not worried about that.
No, I'm asking this question literally because I made a prediction. I don't know if it was pre-COVID, but this year we as a sector, but probably maybe me even, would get calls from people saying, okay, I'm ready to put serious amount of money to work. So where do I go? And I'm not giving investment advice, but I'm also thinking, are we as a sector ready to absorb that? So I have no doubt that the money is coming, or maybe even already there and knocking on some of our doors of people that we've interviewed or other people in the space. And they're going to be 9 zeros and maybe even more. The question is, do we have the infrastructure? Do we have the tissue to put that to work?
Well, before I answer that question, I would say my view is, where do you focus? So you focus at the roots of the supply chain and you focus on the risky stuff, taking risks. And because the scale up thing and will come from others, okay?
Will come.
Or you split your thing into one thing that is less risky and one thing that is more risky. But you need.
Yeah, you can take a portfolio approach. Yeah, you could. Yeah, you're in charge, Bastien. You can do whatever you want.
Exactly. So I take a portfolio approach. I put something on things that are already scaling up, so I'm almost sure I'm going to get a return. And then I'm taking the other half on risky things, really at the roots of supply chain, Indonesia, Africa. And then I try to work with a coalition of actors, which is backed by the offtake of big companies. So a Nestlé can say, yeah, I'm going to continue to buy that palm oil. But if you can make it better, I will continue to buy it. I can commit that I'll stick with this supplier, because if he makes effort to change, I'll stick to that. And that's the first point for an investor, to have a strong off-taker. So within those supply chain, and not somewhere else, within those supply chain, I will work with that. I will connect with any organization that helps in stimulating entrepreneurship. We've got a great organization called Seed Stars around here. They do incubation work in Africa, in developing countries, mostly on entrepreneurship and tech. Let's take these guys to the countryside and rural areas. I'll connect with universities and young people.
Otherwise, they keep coming up with better yogurt routes for stuff. No, they need to come up with stuff for farmers.
Yeah. And connect with local organization, people who have, boots on the ground. We'd be happy to participate to this kind of stuff and identify, okay, here there is an opportunity. Here there is an opportunity. Lots of organizations locally are in touch with farmers. They are in touch with those opportunities, but they can't come and say, this is a company that you can fund, because often the investors are like, oh, it's too risky. I need to have my return, et cetera, et cetera. So it's about creating a fertile environment within supply chains, at the roots of supply chain, to take some risks, try things out. And you can be sure, because it's so desertic in terms of funding there, that if you put a little bit of investment with this entrepreneurial spirit in connection with the purchase from brands, you will succeed. As I said, with the example on palm oil in Ivory Coast, there's so much to do. So the value is there. You almost have to pick it from the trees, but you need to get organized to have a basket.
The low-hanging fruit, literally. Yeah,
exactly.
So you would pick Indonesia, palm oil, and Africa. What would you do in Africa? I mean, where does it hurt the most, do you think?
No, I'd put Indonesia as a whole, not just palm oil, but I would pick region. In Indonesia, Africa are places where you could have a huge impact on ecosystems and on people by looking at that. I'll give you another example, because to me it's so impressive. We worked a bit with Givaudan in flavors and fragrance supply chains, and vetiver and patchouli.
Sorry, for anybody, who are they? What do they do?
So Givaudan is one of the leading brands that supplies all the flavors and fragrances that you will use in products, in food, etc. So they have hundreds of raw materials, from orange peel to turpentines to patchouli and vetiver and all these things that you will use. They do it chemically, but they also have a big division on naturals. And the appetite from the market is, okay, can we have natural products? So the natural flavors are important. So they go all around the world and they source those raw materials. And we realized that in Indonesia, they source vetiver and patchouli. And we studied the process.
What are they?
They are a grass and a little tree, a little bush, and that you can harvest their flowers, fruits, roots, and then you can process them into flavors. So you have to distill. So you heat the water, you process it, and then you will collect the essential oil, which is a real small fraction of it. So what you need to do on the agricultural side, a lot of things have already been done. But then when you look at the transformation in distillation process, lots of very artisanal distillers burn a lot of wood to heat up the water, boil it, collect the essential oil, and then they have to cool it down. So they take the water from the river, they heat the water from the river, which has huge impacts, and then they cool it down. We sent one student for 3 months to look at the process and look, we could really recover the heat from that system. So you don't have to use so much wood, which is coming from illegal areas and sometimes, and you could really transform the process. So we sat down with Givaudan to say, okay, and this is a discussion that is ongoing. How can we create a more efficient distillation and create models that are practically working for the communities who distill? It's not a huge investment, but could be backed up by Givaudan to scale. And this has been, this kind of ideas that are, as you said, low-hanging fruits. You just have to study a bit, take interest in what's happening, and then you see opportunities to drive change at scale.
Yeah, I remember I interviewed Paul Chatterton of WWF, or of the Sustainable Finance, or the Landscape Finance Lab. And they were working in the supply chain of H&M, I think. One of the main negative impacts was actually the dyeing industry, so the coloring industry, and was one of the main reasons of deforestation in, I think, Bangladesh, in one of I'm getting the country wrong, because they needed the boilers. They needed the hot water. So they figured, and many of them could be greatly replaced by solar, etc. Just that nobody looked at what was the reason of deforestation. It wasn't the wood. Yeah, it was the wood to burn, the water to boil for the coloring of and that was a huge, or is still, they're working on it, a huge negative impact on the supply chain of H&M, which probably they never even knew. And because nobody went there and asked the questions before.
Yeah.
But the landscape was being deforested because they were coloring the clothing.
And the solution is not to say, hey guys, don't do this. No, because you just look at how much they pay. The little entrepreneurs who distill, they pay 25, 30, up to 40% of their cost is fuel cost. Fuel cost to be able to power the machine. If you tell them, look, do you want to reduce your fuel cost? But you need to go through a phase where your risk is going to be backed by some investment and maybe some projects, subsidy, assistance, etc. that will work. It's not complicated.
Transition finance, yeah.
So with the 1 billion, we could do a lot.
It's, I think, one of the most sexy thing is flexible, fair, well-structured working capital, which probably is going to change the world in many, many ways. But it's something that we greatly overlook. In transition from farmers and transition for companies, like there is a way to transition. We know there are more efficient ways, but of course there might be some years where you can take a hit, or your yield go down, or your production goes down, or et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. But if you structure that well, you can go through. And that's why I think finance is so interesting, because you can help companies, farmers, consumers go through that transition, and you can finance that. Partly blended, partly investor, whatever situation. I don't say everything has to be a financial investment, obviously, but money can play a very interesting transition role there.
I would indeed really look at not doing it alone. So I would involve brands as off-takers. I would work in the supply chain, and I would definitely go for blended finance, because some of the things that will be achieved are for common good. So there are a lot of public finance that is coming in as a guarantee, as a support, and then I would go for subsidies and grants to complement some of the things that need to be done, that could be done through a subsidy or grant, so that it doesn't affect the yield or the return of the investment. So I would really try to do this collectively. We've been talking with BNP Paribas. There's a guy there, Pierre Rousseau, who's doing an amazing job in starting these kind of projects. So this is the approach that we often like to take, and that's what we would do if we had 1 billion of investment.
No, it's very interesting. We recorded last week with the Perennial Fund, who has been a few times on the show actually, and will be out soon, hopefully. And their strategy of financing the transition of farmers in the US has been on 3 pillars. One is access to peer support. Like, you need others that are on the same journey, or that are a few steps ahead. You need to see, touch, feel as a farmer, but also as an entrepreneur, that this is possible, that is not crazy. Access to independent advice. Like, you need someone that's not paid by an input company to tell you how to apply, you need good agronomic, in case of a farmer, advice. Access to markets, both the offtake agreements during the transition and after, in the case of organic, in the case of regenerative organic. You need a company that says, I'm going to buy it. I'm committing to offtake for the common good, maybe carbon, maybe water, maybe biodiversity. That depends where you are, what is possible. And then the third, but only the third, not the first two, because the first two are access to support and access to markets, is capital. Could be flexible, blended, a mix of everything. But it's not, without those, it needs to be the three of them, because without the market, none of the entrepreneurs are going to move. Without the support, they don't even know it's possible, let alone, obviously, they're not going to move. So you need these three puzzle pieces for a successful, I think, transition in general. And they really nailed that in terms of agriculture piece. And I'm very excited to share the podcast. Will be out when you're listening to this, probably. So go and find it. But it's very interesting, the transition finance piece. It's not necessarily only about the finance. It needs the other pieces, because otherwise we're just throwing money at something and putting more debt on the books of entrepreneurs and farmers, which honestly don't really need it.
Absolutely.
It's going to be funny how much something as unsexy as working capital is going to change things. So I think it's a transition capital is going to be a big driver.
Yes.
Okay, so we talked about the fund. You're no longer in charge of that fund, unfortunately, but you have a magic power to change one thing overnight in the agricultural, but definitely, let's say, the land use industry. What would you use your magic wand for if you can change one thing overnight? What would that be?
I would give a connection to nature and to life sciences and some kind of basic education about how nature works to every business person in the world. I would make every CEO of a company aware of what are the nature's processes and how they, as a human being, are connected and relying on nature. That awareness, if it could be instantly put in their hearts, in their minds, and in their gut.
You have the power, Bastien.
It would be, I think, life-changing, because somehow it would facilitate and accelerate the alignment and the decision-making, because it comes from the gut. When someone makes a decision, it comes from the gut as much as from the heart and the mind. But I would put them connected to that so that they are quicker in making decisions. They are quicker in taking risks, in embracing the unknown, and having this faith that nature can do it and that solutions will emerge, etc., etc. Not trying to control everything, but releasing a bit of control and trusting.
I think it's a really good answer. And what do you believe to be true about regenerative agriculture that others don't believe to be true? And I definitely stole/borrowed this question from John Kemp, who you often ask us about agriculture in general. So what do you believe to be true that you see others actually not really believing?
Well, what I believe is that nature does it for you. And because it does it for you, it costs less. And therefore, it's beneficial economically. Often people think that regenerative agriculture is another layer of a punitive ecology approach. It's going to be a series of don't-dos, and therefore they're going to be costs, and you're going to produce less, etc. Because it's, how normative and punitive ecology has been imposed or proposed to farmers in the past. The thing is, as soon as you do it, you realize that the earthworms, they do plow for you. And when they do that, actually, you don't need to go out with your tractor and your plow and spend time, money, petrol to do that. But to be able to realize that this little earthworm is going to plow that field for you, if you just give him some feed, which means planting some seeds. This is a paradigm shift. We don't think like that. So we as humans, we believe, and we had to do that. We had to dominate nature in a way to survive. I was reading Lewis and Clark, Odyssey. They were killing bears every day to survive and to eat. So they had to fight against nature. We're now in a new era where we recognize nature as fragile, but also incredibly powerful. So we can work with her to unlock that power. And that will make us realize that actually we don't have to do everything ourselves. Nature does it for us, and we have to trust that. It's just a bit like the planting of trees. Instead of conserving forest and let nature plant trees, we want to all go out and plant lots of trees. That's good. But just realize that nature does it faster, better, and cheaper than us.
I think it's a perfect way to end this conversation. Thank you, Bastien, for your time, for your openness. And I don't think it's the last time we talk. I hope it's not the last time we talk. I think we learn a lot on commodities, on large companies, on what is possible on the ground and how to make change. So thank you so much for sharing today, and we'll be in touch.
And thank you, Koen, for the great podcast you've created and the inspiration you vehicle and you carry to everyone through this podcast. Thank you.
If you found the Investing in Regenerative Agriculture and Food podcast valuable, there are a few simple ways you can use to support it. Number 1, rate and review the podcast on your podcast app. That's the best way for other listeners to find the podcast, and it only takes a few seconds. Number 2, share this podcast on social media or email it to your friends and colleagues. Number 3, If this podcast has been of value to you, and if you have the means, please join my Patreon community to help grow this platform and allow me to take it further. You can find all the details on patreon.com/regenerativeagriculture or in the description below. Thank you so much and see you at the next podcast. Dear friends of the podcast, I'm super excited to share with you the online video course Investing in Regenerative Agriculture and Food. How to put money to work in regenerating soils at scale and growing a lot of tasty food while doing it. Why are we doing this course? After 100 interviews and more than 100 hours of audio asking the question how to put money to work in regenerating soils, and have been following the space since 2011 and recording these podcasts since 2016, we thought it was time to share our lessons learned. What have we seen in the space over the last years? How have we built our decision-making framework? What to focus on with the podcast? How have we picked interviewees? What questions should you ask? What is happening in the space? What should you read? What should you listen? What should you watch? How to approach this space? For whom is this course? You, the soil builders and investors in this space. The soil builders, people working in this space, entrepreneurial farmers, fund managers, vehicle builders, crowd investing, platform builders, agtech companies, farm-to-gut food companies, permaculture, keyline designers, holistic management consultants, etc., etc. People that are building soil at scale. And the investors who are putting their own money to work through their family office or as private individuals, or people who are putting other people's money to work through foundations, institutional capital, banks, insurance companies, etc. Is this course free? No. This is pay what you think it's worth. Meaning, I have no way of knowing what this course will be worth to you. And I'm very aware that among the listeners of this podcast, we have people with very different means. So I'm inviting you, if this course is creating value to you, and if you have the means, to consider paying what you think it's worth. Thank you. So what is this course? It's currently a series of 17 videos, mostly ranging from 10 to 15 minutes, plus PDF slides, so you don't have to ride along. We're gonna look into why invest in regenerative agriculture and why extractive agriculture is so risky, how to invest, what kind of frameworks you could and I think should build, what to invest in, what kind of co-investors you could find, or what kind of investors you could find if you're a soil builder. Every lesson will have a digging deeper part where I will share what kind of reports, what kind of interviews, what kind of videos you can look into if you want to dig deeper. We're going to look at nutrient density, landscape design, and a lot more. So what is it not? It's not a list of investable deals. Unfortunately, that doesn't exist in this world. We're really at the beginning of the regenerative agriculture and food revolution. It's also not investment advice. Before making any investment, please find professional investment advice. So get ready, get a cup of coffee, a cup of tea, or whatever you're drinking. Click on the link below, sign up, and I'm really looking forward to your feedback.